And my regular guest on Outback Mornings with Tech Talk is Mathew Dickerson, technologist, futurist, speaker, author and poet, and he didn't know it. He's not a singer though, are you, Matt?
I'm not a singer. I'm a poet and I don't know it, but I'm not a singer and I haven't got one that rhymes with singer, sorry.
We keep bringing that subject up. One day you might do some karaoke for us. Interesting that you sent a press release out that I found absolutely fascinating. 30 years since the mobile phone network was turned on in Dubbo, which would have been much the same for many big rural centres.
Yeah, I think Dubbo was pretty much ahead of the region in terms of when it was turned on, and it was a big occasion. I remember I actually had the pleasure of connecting the first mobile phone in Dubbo, and it's obviously significantly different. They had their own prefixes, so 636 was the prefix that Dubbo regional numbers were assigned. So 018 was the prefix for all mobile phones in Australia. There were 9-digit numbers, of course, and we were allocated 636. So all numbers in the Dubbo region started with 636, and it's funny because I still see now people with a number that might start with 0418 636, and I'll say to them, I bet you had this number for a long time since the analog days, and of course they always say, yes, I have. So that's the prefix. So they only allocated 1,000 numbers for the Dubbo region for mobile phone numbers at that particular time.
Now, there were other, mobile phones before that, weren't there? More primitive ones.
Certainly, you're right. Way back, in 1981, Telecom introduced the first system in Australia. It was the 007 system, and they were huge phones that only went into a car. You couldn't carry them around, of course. They were only in cars and needed the car power to drive them. They were about 14 kilograms, tucked away in the boot. And they weren't truly cellular. In other words, you couldn't actually move from cell to cell. You could actually talk in the car on the phone, but if you kept driving, it would drop out. You'd have to ring that person back. So you typically pull over and make the phone call. Not that popular after a year after the launch, and that was in Sydney and Melbourne, the only places you could use it. They had a massive 1,300 subscribers to that particular service. So it wasn't entirely popular. It wasn't really till 1987 when the cellular system was introduced in Australia, and that was the one that allowed you to move between cells or around cells, and they were the first ones with handhelds, although handhelds, I think you needed to be built like Arnie Schwarzenegger to use it as a handheld because they were pretty big units as well.
Big house brick type thing.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So interesting evolution, for want of a better word, of the whole mobile phone phenomenon. And so once it was rolled out 30 odd years ago, or 30 years ago, that sort of changed everything, didn't it?
It certainly did. And the first system that came was the AMP system, or analog system as most people called it. And that was a system that gave us fairly good range from a tower, but not a lot of services. You could make a phone call and that was about it. And if you compare to today's phones, people don't use their phones that often for a phone call. They're using them for so many other things besides phone calls. But at its peak, the AMP system got to 2 million subscribers, so a little bit more than 1,300 of the 007 system. So essentially, you had that first AMP system rolled out, and then GSM rolled out. Now, we actually had some competition in Australia as well. In 1992, Optus and Vodafone came to Australia. And not long after that, we had GSM. And GSM was the first digital network that launched. And it wasn't great for us in regional Australia because the digital network wasn't as good a range as the analog network, but the features were much better. So that's when we started to see text messaging. That's when we started to see a SIM card. So you could take a SIM card out and swap it amongst different phones. So things that we see today, take for granted today, started back in those early 90s. And so that first GSM system was referred to generally as 2G, and then we rolled out through 3G, 4G, and we're now just getting to the point where we're getting 5G. But certainly things have rolled along fairly quickly through there, and just to gloss over all of that, we're now at 30 million subscribers, so more subscribers in Australia, so there are more phone services than there are actual people, and that doesn't make sense when you first hear it, but when you think about people using their tablets or maybe sometimes their work phone and their home phone, you can soon get to the point where you add up more than one service per person.
Well, we know there's more sheep than people, but I didn't know there was more mobile phones than people. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
Mathew, you're listening to Tech Talk with Mathew Dickerson. So how much were people paying like 30 years ago? Did they work on plans? Did they have to pay off an expensive phone? What happened there?
Well, you couldn't pay off the phone. You had to buy it outright. And so I remember selling phones at the time. It was a big deal when someone actually bought a phone. So the first handheld phones, they were over $5,000. And that's in 1990 money. So in today's terms, that would be well over $10,000, maybe even up to $15,000 in equivalent money.
Yeah.
So you can imagine someone walking into a phone store today and handing over $15,000 to buy their handheld mobile phone. Most people are over the expectation now that they pay nothing for their phone because it goes on a plan. So that was a big change when plans came in and you could actually pay off effectively the phone. But the plans themselves, to actually have a service, they're incredibly expensive as well. So you would pay about $50 a month just for the privilege of having the service. And again, equate that to today's money, that might be $150 a month. But you got nothing for that. You got the ability to have a service, and then you paid for your calls, and your calls were very expensive. And some plans even had it where you would receive a phone call and actually pay for part of that phone call as well. So it didn't matter whether you made the phone call or received the phone call, you were still paying, and still paying in the order, again, current terms, in the order of a couple of dollars per minute. So you didn't get on there and have a bit of a gossip about what was happening on Friday night at the pub. You got on there, did your business, and then got off the phone fairly quickly. So it certainly has changed the unlimited phone call concept when that came in. And it wasn't that long ago that you still paid an amount of money for a certain number of minutes or a certain number of calls or dollars worth of phone calls on your phone service. When unlimited calls came in, that was a huge breakthrough across the whole mobile phone industry.
Yeah, I remember people bemoaning the fact that people were calling them too often and they were paying for those phone calls. And did you ever hear stories of, I've heard of stories of these executives or something sitting around at a restaurant and they're all talking on their phones to show off. Oh, look, we've got a phone. And then all of a sudden, two of them rang while they were talking. And they went, oh. So, have you heard stories like that?
I have heard stories along those same lines, and I'm sure it happened regularly. It looks pretty impressive walking down the street with your handheld phone to your ear until the phone rings. That's when it becomes a bit embarrassing.
So there you go. And I guess the future of mobile phones, they're well and truly there. It's not just a phone, it's a device, it's a computer, it does everything.
You're right.
And the landline's had it, hasn't it? It's pretty much gone.
Well, it was several years ago, or many years ago actually, when it got to the point where landlines were actually surpassed by the number of mobile subscriptions in Australia. So that point has well and truly come and gone. And you've got the continual evolution of those services, as you said at the beginning. So, for example, the analogue network was switched off in 2001, so that 1G network was turned on in Australia in 87 and turned off in 2001. Then you had the CDMA network, which was turned on in 99 and turned off in 2008. The 2G network, we've mentioned, turned on in about 93, and then that's already been turned off now. That's 2016, that was shut down. So you've got this continual rolling evolution of the various generation of services. And one of the reasons they shut down those, some people have said to me in the past, why don't they just leave them going? Apart from the maintenance of the equipment that you would have to do to keep them going for an ever-dwindling number of users, one of the main reasons they shut them down is to reuse those same frequencies. So the frequencies that might have been used in terms of, say, the analogue network in the early days, those same frequencies are still being used today, but just obviously used in different networks. So because you get certain spectrums that lend themselves towards mobile phone communications and still being safe, then effectively you want to be able to reuse those frequencies as you go forward.
Yeah. So, I'm speaking with Mathew Dickerson. This is our regular Tech Talk program, and just wanted to change the subject again, and you brought this one up, and that's solar production. Seems like the air's a bit cleaner in the world, and there's a bit of an uptake on solar. Well,
it's actually quite interesting. There's never really been a lot of studies done on what would happen if we had cleaner air in terms of solar production, and it's pretty hard to orchestrate a shutdown of the world to see less pollution and see what that does to solar production. But of course, we've had a forced shutdown of so much of the world with COVID-19. And so they've done some testing, and basically they've taken out weather patterns and changes in weather to account for that. And they've found, for example, in Delhi, where you've got obviously fairly high levels of air pollution, you've found an increase of 8% in solar production because of reduced pollution. And what I like about this is that, yeah, sure, it's logical and sensible that we've got less pollution, you get more solar production. But one of the aims of producing power via solar and via wind is to reduce the amount of actual pollution we have. So it almost is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we can reduce the amount of pollution, we'll increase the amount of solar. Increase the amount of solar, we reduce the amount of pollution. So it goes hand in hand.
Yeah. So watch this space, and let's hope the air gets cleaner. But I guess there's a few more hoops to jump through before that happens.
Yeah, and it also is a good indicator. We do have some big solar farms out around our region, Wayne, obviously places like Nevertire, places like Nyngan, a few ones around Wellington and Mudgee. So certainly around the listening area there are some solar farms, and we don't have a major problem with pollution. Sure, we've still got some pollution, but nothing like, say, Delhi, for example. So it does make sense to build some solar farms out around these areas because we've already got that clean air.
Before we sign off, Matt, let's talk about the fact that people are using Zoom and video conferencing a lot more, and it looks like you can, I guess process your will or communicate your wishes, your will on a video link now. Is that right? Yeah,
that's in the UK. They've just actually changed the law to make it legal for you to do a will and witness a will via a video link. In the past, the will had to be witnessed by two people that weren't beneficiaries in the will, and that kind of makes sense. You don't want people sitting there putting pressure on you to sign the will. So two people had to witness it, but they had to be physically there to witness you signing the will. And obviously that makes it pretty difficult, especially given the fact that some people making their will are in that target demographic that is the highest risk category for COVID-19. So that makes it a little bit more interesting for people trying to get witnesses there close enough to actually witness the will. So these are the sort of things that are changing so quickly. Changing the law to allow it to be legal to witness a will by a video. If you would have said it to me 6 months ago, I would have said that'll come in 10 or 20 years' time. But COVID-19 has pushed a lot of things in the technology space, brought a lot of things forward that may have come anyway, but has brought them forward much quicker. So in the UK at the moment, they've made it retrospective. So if someone made a will 3 months ago, for example, then it goes all the way back to January this year. If they did that and had it witnessed via video, then that would still be legal as it stands right now. So that law was made retrospective, and going forward, they're saying till about 2022 at this stage. But again, COVID-19, as we all know, the landscape changes very quickly.
And that may happen here. Do you think that might be implemented here?
I think what we see around the world is things are changing so quickly that things that happen in one part of the world often are copied by other parts of the world, because if it makes sense in the UK, sure, it probably makes sense in Australia as well. So I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not here to give legal advice, so I would say go and talk to your solicitor about your will if that's the case, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see some laws change around this area, because the same problems we have in Australia, they've witnessed those in the UK, and this is their solution.
Matt, thanks very much for your time. Appreciate it. I know you're a busy man, and a very interesting historical journey for mobile phones, or regarding mobile phones. That was always good. Look forward to catching up next week.
Sounds great. Thanks, Wayne.
And you're listening to Outback Mornings.